Well, I'm very grateful that she is here. She is assistant professor at the European Institute and associate research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and assistant editor of South European Society and Politics, the journal. So thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you. Well, it's sometimes good to go and get about for a change, so it was actually a pleasure for me, so thanks very much for inviting me. I know I'm expected to speak more on the Turkey debate, but if you'd allow me, I'd also like to make just a few comments on your findings, because I find them of tremendous significance. And I think that they show us, first of all, leaving aside the policy implications, I think they also have some significant conceptual ramifications. When I hear this whole story. And what I mean by this conceptual ramification is, first of all, us critical scholars, we have this notion of intertextuality, interdiscursivity, how discourses, how debates on one side in one field connect to debates in other fields. And this is exactly what we're seeing in this EU debates on Turkey, as you two have been describing. And I see this mostly at three interrelated levels. Now, one level is, of course, intertextuality with domestic debates of these countries, particularly relating to the way in which they talk about their national identities, in terms of their narratives on their national identity constructions. For example, you both mentioned, and you especially, about the debate in Germany and how it's very much intertwined with debates on Turkish migrants in Germany and immigration in Germany. And you cannot conceptualize this independently from the way in which it's related to the German national identity in its current form. So I think that's very important to mention. And the second, relating more specifically perhaps to the political elite, is of course the intertextuality with political ideologies. Now, you mentioned, for example, the left-right spectrum, and there are many other sort of ideological, I would say, frames perhaps that we can see this through. Euroscepticism, for example, one might argue, might be one of those frames through which you can discern certain tendencies towards Turkey's accession in some of these countries. But again, I think even there, especially when we're looking at ideologies, we have to be very careful and refrain from generalizing conclusions. And for example, in the very case of Euroscepticism, you have on the one hand, the Scandinavian or the British Eurosceptics who seem to be very much in favor of Turkish accession because, of course, the way in which they conceptualize the European project. But also you have, let's say, smaller Eurosceptic groups, for example, that you see in the European Parliament, that also have a very xenophobic, very inward-looking to Europe, who are also very much vehemently opposed to Turkey's accession. And the third level of intertextuality that I see is, in fact, intertextuality with the debates within Turkey. Now, it's interesting how there is sort of a direct relationship between the debates in Europe on Turkey and actually the debates that we're having very much here today within Turkey. And you see that in debates relating to democratization, as Gerard earlier mentioned, debates, whether or not, the reform in civil-military relations is actually a necessary step towards democratization, or perhaps it might be a step towards further civilian authoritarianism and erosion of secularism. I don't know, in terms of the way in which the debate is being framed. And these are exactly along the lines that we're debating this issue today in Turkey. Now, so those are just a few conceptual points that I wanted to make. Now, coming to more specific issues, and perhaps you could enlighten me further on that in the question and answer session. Just take them as my questions, take the liberty to speak. I'm just very much interested in two things. One thing that's of particular interest to me is the foreign policy perceptions of Turkish foreign policy within Europe today. Because we have, again, our own domestic dominant narrative about, the grandeur, the emergence of the grandeur of Turkish foreign policy and how we're becoming such an influential actor in the neighborhood. And we have some idea of how this is being perceived among some in the US administration, for example. But I think what's of particular concern is how is this being perceived in Europe? Is it just oversimplified as a turning away from the West, or is there a more nuanced view on that front as well? And how does that really play into the debates? And also, of course, how does the debate on the Euro crisis impact on all these perceptions? Can we say that perhaps that has had an impact on this changing narrative that you two were mentioning, especially in the last year or so, right? I mean, perhaps it has some sort of relationship, and all these turbo country metaphors, you know, they're also quite, you know, they might be economic related as well, how they sort of, whether or not they have this sort of more, I would say, American mindset of Turkey as a bright star, glossing over many of the domestic problems just because of these issues of the economy and growth and activism in foreign policy or whatever, or something else. Okay, and now coming back to the Turkey side of things, now how these are received in Turkey. Now, first of all, are we really debating Europe and Turkey these days? Well, you know, not much, I would say. I mean, I know this has almost become of a cliche to say it, but we all know after 2005, 2006, the debate on Europe within Turkey seems to have waned to a considerable extent. However, of course, there is still a certain thread going on, both among the public opinion and also among the political elites. Now, of course, it's difficult to distinguish public opinion from the discourse of the political elites, but just for analytical purposes, you know, just to make it oversimplified, I'd like to make a distinction between the two. Now, there has been quite a lot of work on Turkish public opinion and Turkish public's attitudes towards the EU. I know there have been Eurobarometer surveys, there have been various academic works that try to measure that. And again, you know, we have the conventional argument that support levels have been going down, that they're down to about 40%, 45% or so. So the stable sort of consensus on European accession in Turkey among public opinion seems to have gone down. Well, I mean, I don't think that's catastrophic, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, we could debate this further, but when you look at previous enlargements, you never see huge amounts of support in previous Eastern enlargement countries. So this doesn't always seem to be a determining factor on the country's European orientations at the end of the day. However, I think you have a rather different story when you look at the orientations of the political elites. I think commitment of a liberal elite, of a democratic elite, is very significant in both countries' trajectory of reform and also, of course, in relation to that, the country's road towards EU accession. And I don't think this is just something that's specific to Turkey. I think it goes for much of the Western Balkan countries as well, right? So it's not, I don't think we are dealing with a very sui generis case here of Turkish reform. But I think political reform is important, that you also mentioned. It's covering now much of the debate in Europe, and also it shows how the debates on Turkey among the EU's political elite play into the developments of political reform here, which in turn, again, play into debates on Turkey in Europe. So there is a cycle of you know, one-to-one relationship between these two spheres in that. Now, how do we see that? Now, when you know, start with the, I would say, you know, dependent variable, as we'd say, you know, the political reform in Turkey, especially in the post-2005 period, you see that, you know, yes, you know, reform, perhaps the stamina has declined, but there has still been important steps, so it hasn't been completely dropped off. However, what we also see is that there seems to be a more selective pattern of democratic reform. So there's not perhaps a more holistic approach to reform, but it seems to be a bit more in tendency with, it seems to be more contingent on the interests of the political elite. Now, why is this the case, and how can we relate it to the debates in the European Union? I think, first of all, we can look at the European Union side of things, and we can argue that this post-2005, you know, EU fatigue in Turkey might also have very much to do with the fact that the debates around among the political elite in Europe has been very much ambivalent and has been giving out very ambivalent signals about Turkey's accession. For example, you know, 2006 you have the absorption capacity debate, then you have the negotiating framework for Turkey, which seemed to, you know, between the lines quite different from the Croatian one, for example. You have the, you know, infamous statements of Sarkozy, Merkel, and you have the Cyprus issue, which, you know, amongst all, feeds into the perceptions in Turkey, both among the political elite and also among public opinion, that the country is being unfairly treated, with the EU using Cyprus as a tool to block accession negotiations. So you have all that sort of negativity playing in. Now, however, this alone, I think, is not enough to explain the debate on Europe within Turkey today, which seems to be no debates to a bit of a Eurosceptic debate. Now, what explains that also, I think, is a more domestic phenomena, and that has to do with the empowerment, the domestic empowerment, the differential empowerment of the elites, both within the society and also vice versa the European Union. Now, we see that, again, I think we also see it in cases like Albania, some places in Western Balkans that Gerard would know better than I do. That's what I've been observing, at least. Basically, the domestic empowerment, which makes the elite feel that it's less dependent on the European Union, that keeps on giving negative messages anyway, and makes it feel more relaxed in pursuing a more selective reform agenda in judicial reform or whatever. Now, just, we don't have to go back too far. Just remember back in March 2011, when the European Parliament's report on the state of Turkish democracy was published, and it was a very critical report. And Erdogan responded, Parliament is entrusted to draft the report, and we are entrusted to do as we see fit, which is basically that we don't care much, what you say about whatever's going on at home. Now, you cannot conceptualize this independently from two things. One, of course, this is a date just prior to the elections. So you cannot conceptualize this from domestic concerns, the domestic Euroscepticism, its core sort of voter that it sort of plays into. And of course, secondly, you cannot conceptualize this independently from the domestic empowerment of the elite, of the Turkish political elite that I was talking about, vice versa the EU, and which in turn reinforces the image of the country as insufficiently democratic, as doing whatever it wants to do, not too much listening to what Europe says or whatever. So these debates, both at home and abroad, they sort of play into each other, and sometimes they can lead to a virtuous cycle, as they did in the pre-2005 phase, and sometimes we have this vicious cycle, as we do today, while the country is making progress, but it's quite bumpy on the road. It's facing certain ups and downs. Now, is there a way out of this? Well, yeah, perhaps there is, although you can't really prescribe anything at this stage. On the part of the EU, one can argue that there'll be upcoming elections in France, 2012, I think Germany, 2013. So you might say, well, perhaps the political balance might be tilted in favor of Turkey's accession. We don't know. Now, I think more importantly, though, on the part of Turkey, the developments, and we have to look at the immediate southern neighborhood, I think, here. So I think we have to be discussing Turkish foreign policy at a broader level than Europe here. Because I think the realization should be, if it hasn't been so far, is that if we want Turkey to have this demonstrative effect in the neighborhood, and especially now with what's going on in Syria and everything, is that it has to look like, as a colleague of ours has called before, it has to look as a democracy in progress, right? So it's very much interlinked that you cannot underestimate Turkey's democratic trajectory and its relations with the EU for its rising influence in the neighborhood. So there has to be some realization that this is not going to work well if the other piece of the puzzle would go missing. And the Arab Spring only serves to strengthen this imperative, especially given the resilience of the Turkish-Kurdish issue and the necessity, of course, for Turkey to practice what it preaches in order to remain a credible actor in its neighborhood. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.